Bushy Breton, from the lead plane in the formation of trainers, could have projected his voice for a good mile and a half without the competition of some 1,200 horsepower in the vicinity. But as it was, his thoughtless bellowing in the direction of the lagging plane was a sheer waste of effort. The little brown man merely beamed and continued to fly his own private formation some 500 feet to the rear. It wasn't stubbornness on the part of the swarthy little fellow. He just didn't understand. At least, that was what the commandant had told Bushy when the instructor had complained the first time. The little man was a major from the Philippine Constabulary, and the commandant had been ordered to teach him to fly. Those were orders, and whether Bushy liked it or not, he was going to teach him to fly. Bushy had stomped out of the office that day, muttering pure treason against the major, the commandant, and the Army in general. That was just after the little brown major had tried to start an engine while Bushy was leaning on the propeller, an incident from which the instructor had escaped intact only because the major, running true to form, had failed to locate the ignition switch. Bushy had sworn after leaving the commandant's office like that day that the little brown major was going to make just one more mistake. Just one. Then, well, there'd be real trouble. Now, somewhere out over the level brown land of Texas, Bushy was trying to get the major to fly with the rest of the formation and doing a very bad job of it. The instructor could see the little man riding way back and smiling and nodding, very friendly, but apparently missing entirely the murderous looks and equally murderous gestures of his leader. Finally, Bushy, in desperation, made a series of long, sweeping movements with his arm, and the little brown major understood. He opened the throttle wide and headed directly for the instructor's plane. His leader wanted him to come in a little closer, and he was following instructions to the letter. Bushy sighed with relief as he saw the ship come forward. He was just about to turn his attention to other matters when he realized that the major, instead of pulling up in his rightful position, was coming right on. Bushy waved again, waved wildly as the major's plane drew closer. "Get back! Get back, you crazy loon!" He cut his yell short and slammed his own throttle open just in time to pull the tail of the ship away from the major's oncoming propeller. "Get away! Get back!" Bushy had the throttle wide open, and his ship was streaking across Texas in a flat dive that was sending the airspeed up past 180. He was fighting for his life now. The major was right behind him, smiling contented in his newfound ability to fly a close formation such as this. Bushy was seen to disappear in the direction of the Gulf of Mexico with the major right behind him. That afternoon, the commandant had a caller. An orderly stepped into his office. "Lieutenant Breton is here, sir." The commandant looked up from his desk. "Send him in." The older man leaned back in his chair as Bushy strode through the door. He knew what was coming. Sit down, Brenton." Bushy paid no attention. His face was haggard. His hand trembled as he lighted a cigarette. "Sir, I've got a wife and family. I can't go on like this." Superior officer nodded. "Trouble with the major again?" Bushy's eyes widened with the memory of it. "Trouble? Do you know that guy just chased me halfway to Corpus Christi? I can't stand it, I tell you. I'm sorry, I got a wife and a family to think about." The commandant made a valiant effort to appear solemn. "Well, you understand, Lieutenant Brenton. There's nothing I can do. My hands are tied. I've been ordered to put Major Chavez through the school, and those orders must be carried out. Now, what seems to be the trouble with the major?" Bushy breathed deeply and snuffed out his cigarette. "The trouble, sir, is that on 2 occasions now he's tried to kill me." "Well, not intentionally, Brenton." "No, perhaps not intentionally, but, well, that doesn't make death any more pleasant. What I came to say, sir, is that, well, I want to be transferred to the West Coast, sir." The commandant idly shuffled the papers on his desk for a moment. You want to be transferred so you won't have to fly with the major, is that it?" Bushy stood up. Yes, sir. Yes, sir, that's it. I love my wife, and I don't want to make her a widow on account of that. Bushy caught himself. The commandant opened a drawer, took out a folder. He turned the leaves and reached for a pen. "You won't have to go to the West Coast, Brenton." Bushy smiled a broad smile of relief. The other officer continued. "Just fly with the major for another 2 weeks. If at that time you're still convinced the man will never be a competent pilot, I'll send a recommendation to Washington that his training be discontinued. That's all, Brenton. Bushy opened his mouth to speak, but the Commandant repeated, That's all, Brenton. That was the last straw. As he paced down the walk from the executive's office, Bushy resolved that if he flew with Major during those 2 weeks, that diminutive little brown visitor from the Philippines would get such a thorough overdose of the unhappier phases of flying that he'd never again set foot in an airplane. The lanky instructor was almost smiling at the thought. He'd been an aerobatics instructor at one time, and what he wouldn't do to that little tan man would be nobody's business. His spirits had risen considerably after that decision, and he was whistling quite gaily as he rounded the corner of a hangar and headed for the machine shop. He was mentally putting the Major through a particularly hair-raising maneuver when he stopped short. Standing in the shade of the testing shed was the Major himself, complete with campaign hat, khakis, and ancient puttees. Arms folded, chin held high, he watched carefully the planes taking off and landing on the runway to the west. Bushy rubbed his chin and considered the possibilities of the moment. Deciding that there was no time like the present, he approached the Major. Well, Major Chavez, nice day, isn't it? The Major turned quickly and smiled when he saw Bushy.
Ah, Lieutenant Brenton. It is a pleasant day, yes, indeed.
He pointed out on the field.
The boys are making very good landings today. Much better than yesterday, no?
Bushy was looking down the line when the Major finished speaking.
Huh? Oh, yeah, much better than yesterday.
He apparently saw what he was looking for now he turned to the Major.
Major Chavez, would you like to join me in a flight? I see my plane is out on the line.
The little man brightened at once.
I should like to go, senor. Or, Lieutenant Brenton. Shall we go?
They went. An hour later, they returned, and Bushy had turned his bag of tricks upside down. He had to give his head a few vigorous shakes before he could get himself out of the cockpit. The little Major had to be carried to the hangar. Bushy felt a touch of remorse as he held a glass of water to the lips of his badly shaken passenger.
Gee, I'm sorry, Major. I guess I poured it on a little too hard, huh?
The little fellow sat up and took a few deep breaths. He looked at Bushy.
You have your revenge now, Lieutenant? No?
Bushy straightened, caught completely off guard.
You have had a great hate for me since I've come here. Have you not, Lieutenant?
There was nothing to say. Bushy felt like a little boy caught in the wrong. The Major continued.
Just now I knew why you wanted me to fly with you. I could see it in your eyes. You are seeking revenge, huh? I could not deny you that which I knew you so much desired. With that, he arose and walked out of the hangar.
Bushy was left standing alone. He'd been thoroughly and painfully whipped. The next day and the next, the Major avoided his instructor. He was flying alone. Bushy felt now that the tables had been turned. He was the one to be hated, and it was very uncomfortable. He was standing on the line the third morning when the little Major took off. Attached to the wingtips of his plane were long white streamers, a warning to other pilots, the bell on the cat. Apparently, the Commandant had ordered this precaution taken after Bushy's last complaint. The instructor felt another pang of guilt. He started for the Commandant's office, sensing trouble just before he got there. He'd felt that something was coming ever since the afternoon when the little Major had been carried from his plane. But he went on into the Commandant's office.
Well, hello, Brenton. I have some orders here for you. You'll take 2 planes, 2 men of your choice, and leave as soon as possible. You're to help survey the fire area to the north. I'll radio further orders later. That's all, Lieutenant.
Fire survey? Bushy could think of things he'd rather do. An hour later, 3 planes were ready on the line. Equipment was loaded, and Bushy and 2 fellow instructors prepared to take off. Bushy glanced about the field and in the sky overhead. The Major was nowhere about. He wished that he might see the little fellow before he left, but... well, what was the difference? He released the brakes and the 3 planes wheeled onto the runway and took off. Over the fire area, the planes separated, Bushy taking the southern front while the other 2 went east and west to patrol the flanks of the fire line. What a place for a forced landing. Bushy had thought of that as he circled high over the line of flaming timber. But he wasn't thinking of it the moment his motor sputtered, picked up, sputtered again, and died. He nosed down and searched quickly for an open spot in the trees. He'd noticed one just a moment ago. Where was it now? Oh, yes, it was behind the next ridge. It was going to be close. He pulled the nose up. The ship was mushing dangerously. He had to clear the ridge. He held his breath as his landing gear brushed the tops of the pines. There was the clearing right ahead. He swung to the right, dropped into a steep slip. He was going to make it. Suddenly, he swerved, jammed the rudder hard over. A tall pine loomed out of the shadow directly ahead. The left wing caught, whirled the ship around. When Bushy came to, he was lying in a tangled mass of wreckage. His hands were bleeding. There was a taste of blood and metal in his mouth. He could move one leg. The other was useless, broken below the knee. His foot crushed. At least he was alive. He crawled into the clear as best he could. And it was then that he looked up at the top of the ridge. The red glow of the fire line beyond showed clearly above the tops of the trees. Bushy realized that here he lay in a death trap, directly in the path of the fire. He was crawling back to the ship now when one of the planes circled over. In a few minutes, the other one came low, made a cautious try at the clearing, failed, went back up. The other tried, narrowly missed a crash in the tall pines. The plane circled, minutes passed, and 4 more arrived. Time after time they attempted to land in the tiny clearing. It was impossible. Bushy tried to wave them off. There wasn't a chance. No use of piling up another one in here. The fire was coming up the ridge in the heat, and the ashes were beginning to sweep down the slope. Bushy could feel it like a sudden hot breath from above. The planes circling like buzzards overhead were being forced back. Bushy watched them, his friends, so close yet powerless to help him. He was edging close to the plane now to keep away from the heat when a new sound, the roar of another motor, echoed in the canyon. Leaning back from his shelter, he saw the plane, not spiraling down from above, but flying directly up the canyon. From the wingtips whipped 2 white streamers. Bushy struggled to get out where he might be seen. He waved wildly. Get away! Don't try it! Don't come in here! The plane thundered overhead, the wheels barely skimming the low trees at the side of the clearing. Bushy shut his eyes. He couldn't look. But there was no crash. The ship pulled up sharply at the end of the canyon, pivoted slowly on one wing, and slipped smoothly into the clearing. What's the matter with you, man? Bushy was dragging himself toward the plane as the major jumped out. You'll never get out of here. You're crazy. You've always been crazy, and now you'll die here, too, just like me. Bushy was lapsing into hysteria as the little major half dragged, half carried him to the ship and tumbled him into the rear cockpit. In a moment, the ship was heading down the clearing. A week later, Bushy came back to the field. From his wheelchair, he watched the flying, and one plane in particular. The streamers were gone. Bushy turned to the officers beside him. Boys, salute the major.